Are you having a hard time keeping aquarium plants alive and algae under control, even though everyone says it's so easy? Me too. Keep watching as I walk you step by step through how I finally attained that mythical prize of balancing my planted tank. Hi, I'm Irene with girltalksfish, here with practical tips on nanofish and planted aquariums. And everybody always says that your goal with plants should be to, quote, balance your tank. Focus on growing healthy plants, and then they'll naturally outcompete the algae in your tank for resources like light, nutrients, and CO2, right? But the question is, how do you do this? Now, I've always had a lot of difficulty keeping even the most beginner plants alive, whether they were slow or fast growing, didn't matter, despite me getting all the right substrate, the lighting, the all-in-one fertilizer. And as a result, I had a lot of algae problems. Now, people online weren't exactly helpful. They called me a noob for not being able to keep plants alive. One person asked me if I was purposely trying to grow an algae farm. Thanks. More importantly, I didn't enjoy looking at or spending time with that aquarium. It was an eyesore. It was depressing. I got to a point where I was sick of it and decided it is time to figure this thing out. Now, before we get started, just remember, plants are living things and they take time to react. So if you make a ton of drastic changes, you can't really tell what worked and what didn't. Only change one thing at a time and then wait 2 weeks, at least in a low-tech tank, and then see what effect it had. We need to slowly learn over time what makes your plants happy. Now, you may have seen this diagram before about the 3 things that plants need to grow and live, which is lighting, nutrients, and CO2 or carbon dioxide. Although some people say that CO2 should be a nutrient technically, but for simplicity's sake, we are going to separate it out. And basically, algae grows anytime any of these things are out of whack. If you have too much or too little light, if you have too much or too little nutrients, so on and so forth. So when people say you need to balance your tank, they're talking about these 3 different components or levers that you can move around need to be in perfect alignment. And the reason why it's so hard is because everybody's aquarium and their water is so different. Okay, if you have a beginner, low-tech aquarium like me, the CO2 lever is basically stable. We're not going to be injecting any CO2 gas, and it's about 3 to 5 ppm carbon dioxide in a normal aquarium with good surface agitation and gas exchange. So let's move right along to lever number 2, lighting. I would just recommend getting a pretty common planted light and then research online to copy somebody else's schedule that matches your exact tank size and type of plants that you're keeping. In my case, I was using the Fluval 3.0 Plant Spectrum LED, and I saw that Bentley Pasco had already done a lot of testing using this same exact light, so I copied his daylight simulation profile. Seemed pretty promising, right? Well, the plants definitely enjoyed it. They started consuming tons of nutrients, so that I was constantly dosing my all-in-one fertilizer practically every day to reach 20 ppm nitrate. Unfortunately, it also started producing tons of algae. I was getting the fluffy brown kind, staghorn, green hair algae. I tried to combat it using a liquid carbon to dose the tank and burn off the algae, but burning off the dead algae means there was tons of particles, making my water really cloudy. And then because the tank was so unbalanced, the algae came back anyways. Eventually, the plants were so covered with algae, they were completely unable to photosynthesize and stopped growing. 3 months later, green hair algae had completely taken over my aquarium. Clearly, this lighting profile wasn't working for me for some reason. So I hit Google again and I found someone else who had a Fluval 3.0 light, a 16-inch tall tank just like me, also battling hair algae, and they posted their light profile that showed less than 40% peak intensity. And they said after 7 weeks of weekly water changes, they were able to get the hair algae under control. There's hope for me. The problem was, yes, I was dosing sufficient amounts of nutrients, but it was way too much light. So why didn't Bentley's awesome light profile work? It does work, but we weren't using the same amounts of CO2. I didn't realize this, but After watching more of his videos, Bentley uses CO2 injections in his aquariums, and I don't. So eventually I set the peak intensity of my light at 30%. And then that was still growing algae, so I gradually decreased the amount of time the light was on until the algae completely stopped growing on new plant leaves. As a result, the very simple schedule I ended up landing on was 6 hours of peak light, 1 hour ramp up, and then 1 hour ramp down. Lesson learned, set your light level, keep it stable, but you want to set it at a low level. Like, what is the minimum amount of time/intensity that your plants need to grow? And then figure out your nutrient level for that particular light level. Once you have it under control, you can totally increase your lighting later. The damage report is that I had lots of plants that were too far gone from being covered in algae and had to be replaced. That brings us to lever number 3, nutrients. Now, if you didn't know, plants need a very exact mix of both macronutrients and micronutrients, where macronutrients they need a lot of, like nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, and then micronutrients they need less of. These are all important building blocks to make leaves, new growth, and to reproduce. Daniel, one of the moderators of the Aquarium Co-op forum, actually pointed out this really cool diagram that's actually for terrestrial plants, but it really applies. It's Liebig's barrel principle that says, quote, plant growth is dictated by the scarcest resource or limiting factor and not by the total resources available. So basically what that means is I need to make sure I have enough of each important nutrient for that plant. And whichever nutrient I don't have enough of is what is going to cap the growth of my plants. So back to my story. What happened after I lowered the lighting? Well, I ended up having an excess of nitrate just produced by the fish poop because the plants were no longer consuming as many nutrients. So I was back to dosing my all-in-one fertilizer only about once every 1 to 2 weeks. I thought everything was hunky-dory, but 2 months later, large holes started appearing in the leaves. Now, if you've ever seen a plant nutrient deficiency chart, which I'll link in the description, holes means usually a sign of potassium deficiency, which, oddly enough, my all-in-one fertilizer contained a lot of. So I started adding a potassium supplement to see if it would help, and I was still getting large holes, large enough that giant portions of the leaves were melting away. Eventually, I was lucky enough to locate a super rare freshwater potassium kit, and it showed that it had less than 5 ppm potassium. What? My guess is that the giant Java fern I have in the front of the tank was sucking all of the potassium out of the water. So once I started dosing a more concentrated potassium supplement, finally the holes went away and the nitrate levels started going down again because the plants had enough potassium to make use of it. Unfortunately, if you can believe this, all of my cryptocoreans melted away. Yeah, the huge increase in potassium, which was meant to help everything, was way too different for them. So it may take months for them to finally get used to my new, healthier water parameters. Lesson learned, if your CO2 and light levels are set, but you still can't figure out what's going on with the nutrients, buy water test kits. I actually have combed the internet, done a lot of research on different sources, articles talking about planted tanks, and I compiled a list of recommended nutrient ranges for nutrients that you can actually test. I ended up buying every single water test kit I could find, except for freshwater magnesium because, I don't know, I don't think they make it yet. So why wasn't my all-in-one fertilizer working even though I had plenty of nitrates? Well, number 1, we mentioned the low potassium from my giant Java fern. Number 2, apparently I have low phosphate, which is a macronutrient that plants need a lot of. And that's because usually you get a lot of phosphates from dry prepared fish foods, but I feed a lot of frozen, live, and high quality foods that don't contain a lot of phosphates. So yeah, that was an issue. I have low GH or general hardness. My soft water doesn't contain any minerals, and then the all-in-one fertilizer I was using also didn't contain any calcium and potassium because they have to make it for people who have hard water. So I ended up having to dose Sea Chem Equilibrium, which has minerals in it, and my live bearers are also now a lot happier with me. Because I had multiple nutrients that I was missing, I would say that nutrient deficiency charts for plants are a good starting point, but they can be really hard to read if you're lacking in multiple nutrients and minerals at the same time like I was. Before we close out the nutrient section, I just wanted to mention as a side note, I know I've been mostly talking about water column nutrients. Obviously, if you have plants that prefer to feed from their roots, like Amazon swords or crypts, and they start to look bad, make sure to feed them plenty of root tabs or provide a nutrient substrate that will keep them happy. At this point, I think I would consider my tank pretty much balanced. There's insignificant amounts of algae, which the algae eaters basically pick off, and I'm starting to see new growth on some of the plants. Now, is my work done though? No. I want to see more new growth on my slower growing plants like the cryptocorynes and java ferns. I believe lighting is now my limiting factor, so I am actually going to go back to Bentley's day simulation profile, but this time using like 40% or maybe 50% peak intensity instead. By increasing the lights, the plants will start eating more, so I got to keep measuring my nutrients. Eventually, I want to get to the point where I don't need to do any more water changes, only minor top-offs and fertilizers if needed. Think I can do it? If you missed my previous video where I talked about what plants exactly went into this back to basics planted aquarium, I've got it linked over here. And also I wanted to say a huge thank you to Lydia and Hampton for the fan mail. You guys are awesome. I love your drawings and being able to reply to you. Take time to enjoy your aquariums, and I'll see you in the next video.